Hi, people. Welcome back to Mind and Soul, the series in which I look at knowledge and education. Clearly, over the last few days, I've been quite inspired because I've done a number of videos in a short span of time. And today, what pulled me to talk on video was something I heard at the COVID-19 conference that was going on today. And in that conference, there was somebody who was saying that uh, it's important for researchers' work to influence policy. And he was complaining that the work of Kenyan researchers is not influencing policy, and yet researchers from abroad have easier access to State House than Kenyan researchers do. So I want to look at what are the issues with that kind of a statement in public. So this expectation that research and data must influence policy uh, has a few issues, and it has been expressed so many times, like through statements like from data to action, from data is king, or data is the new oil, or we need to do research to inform policy. And I want to say that this idea is dangerous. It's dangerous because it makes two assumptions. The first assumption is that numbers are neutral. Yet, the reality is that numbers hide the values of the people who collect those numbers. So, for example, if I decide I'm going to come to your neighborhood and I want to find out uh, why children are not doing well in school, I can decide to collect data on how many children have wear shoes. Now, what if I go to the Ministry of Education and say, in this neighborhood X, children are not doing well because 6 out of 10 do not have access to a pair of shoes? See, you start asking who collected that data and what for, why were the shoes important? And then later on you find that there's a shoe store that has signed a contract with some politician to come and provide free shoes for the community. So from that example, you can see that the research was not neutral and that the numbers were not exactly neutral either. And I'm going to link you to a video by Kathy O'Neill, and I encourage you to look at all the work that she has done. She's the author of a book called Weapons of Math Destruction, and she's a mathematician with a PhD in mathematics from Harvard. And she talks about how numbers hide the values of the people who collect them. And so we should not be taking numbers as neutral. Numbers do lie. So that assumption that numbers are neutral is an assumption we should not be making. The second assumption in the data is king kind of logic is that we can have data without people. So the people who want this data to inform policy don't want to ask the hard questions about who collected the data and why, and about who. And in that way, thinking of data this way is dehumanizing. So, for example, in the case of COVID-19, and people are saying that doctors and medical researchers have information on what is happening health-wise to people. You cannot just collect the data without contacting the doctors themselves, the people on the ground, because just looking at the numbers and the records that they make does not give you the full picture. You need to hear their stories about what it is like to treat people who are sick with the minimal resources available. And if you remember the Lipa Kama Tender movement, that was what the doctors were saying. They were saying you can have all the numbers at Ministry of Health, but to come and treat people is a different story altogether. Vitu kwa ground ni different. And it's the same thing I was demanding about CBC. I was saying it's one thing for you to call all the heads of institutions and ask them about education, but have you asked what it means to be a teacher, especially in a school with very few resources? Have you found out that the thing that they needed most was a new curriculum? So data that does not take care of the people who collect it or about whom the data is collected is a very dangerous idea. Basically, it is a fantasy that you can have knowledge without people. And in other words, you can have abstract knowledge which has no relation to people, place, and time. And I talked about that in my video on theory. So the other thing about data which doesn't take care of people is that it's an assertion of power. Because basically, if you're the data collector, you're saying that removing questions about who collected it, how it was collected, and about whom it was collected, you're basically asserting power to impose that data on policy without being questioned. And you're basically saying that people don't matter, what matters is the knowledge. And this is how we get bad policy, where the implications on real lives are not considered. And this kind of arrogance, epistemic arrogance, I would call it, we are already familiar with it because that was how racism was constructed. Some guy in Europe or wherever decides to cook up a story, how people are inferior and whatever. And before it is questioned, this so-called research is informing imperial policy. It's informing the colonial soldiers, and it's informing even scientific experiments without being questioned. So, for example, you have horror stories like the experiments that were done in Africa, measuring the skulls and doing experiments on Africans to prove that they were intellectually inferior. Or you can have others like the experiments, the famous Tuskegee experiment in the US, and I'll put a link there for you to see what can be done in the name of research informing policy. There's also a more recent debate, and I will give you the links to that, about the RCTs, which is the randomized clinical trials, which was a debate just as recently as a few weeks ago. The RCTs are clinical trials which are borrowed from medicine. In medicine, before a drug is released to the market, the company making the drug or whoever, they come and use very specialized clinical trials, meaning they experiment on people and see the effect of that drug before it is approved and released to the market. So now people are using that to experiment on people. And the controversy in this case was wanting people to pay water bills, so you deny them water without them knowing that they are being denied water because it's an experiment, and then you collect the data and produce a research. It's a very unethical way of doing research, but of course the researchers who are involved in it don't want to be held to account, which is actually the problem of this idea of data to policy. Let me just use a better example. You know, the prank comedies where people pretend, for example, you're given there's a scenario where people believe that somebody is sick and then they come to help, and then they wonder why their help is not working, and then as the audience we are supposed to laugh at that story and be amused by how this person doesn't know, and then at the end they are told, oh, look at the camera over there, you know, it was a trick. But this kind of, even in comedy, this kind of comedy is a very low form of comedy. It's a sign of lack of imagination, because a good artist and a good writer should be able to write a script where he imagines how people would react to a certain situation. But now we are no longer imagining, we are putting RCTs even in comedy. And this is a sign of lack of imagination, all the way from the academics to the artists, and we can talk about that in a different episode. So this idea that you can have research that directly informs policy is not an idea that we should embrace. Okay, I understand the frustration of academics. I mean, even me, I'm there. You know, you're doing all this research and you're seeing the problem with policies or that something could be better done in another way, and that knowledge is not used, it sits in the library. But that again is a political problem. Application of research to real life issues is a political process. And if academics don't want to do that political work of finding out why that is not happening, then they should just leave their research alone, let it sit in the library. But we cannot have research going straight from my house to State House. I mean, even you, especially the people who never agree with me, can you imagine if Dr. Andia was informing research policy? Some of you would faint. So this means that as academics, we should not be asking why our research is not being used by State House. If we had a properly conscious political leadership, what they would say is whenever somebody from outside the country comes with interesting research that can be implemented, let them go to the Kenyan academics first. Let the Kenyan academics see through it. And let them talk about it and probably even talk in public so that people can hear, because for this very simple reason, policy affects everybody. So you shouldn't be just implementing knowledge that people have no idea and then it will affect them in some way. And if we academics understood this, we would understand that our problem of research, because people keep saying, oh, Kenyans are not doing research, they are not publishing, we would stop seeing it as a problem of lack of research methods and a problem of politics. Because if we want people to do research, we don't need more workshops. What we need is a culture of people listening to ideas, debating ideas. But academics keep hiding from debate. We play language games. We run away from disagreement. We fear disagreement so much, almost more than politicians. Then if we're going to behave like that, we should not be surprised that people no longer take our research seriously. And more than that, we are not inspiring the next generation to do research. Because if we want the next generation to research, they have to hear us talking about our research like it matters, not talking about our research as I published, that's why I'm a professor, but saying this is what our research means for the larger public. So data and research must be subject to review. And in fact, that is why the universities are supposed to have very engaged classes, not these controlled classes where the syllabus is policed from the government. What we need is students to hear our ideas. So that, because students, since they are younger or maybe not, but the fact that they are not as specialized as you, they are able to ask you questions that make you think, hiya, I didn't consider that in my research, or that make you see, oh, this kind of idea is not obvious, or the impact is not obvious. That's the value that students bring to knowledge. I don't know if students know, but our knowledge is refined by students. And that's why we are supposed to share what we are doing in class. We also have another way of reviewing research called peer-reviewed journals. Now, these are journals where when you submit an article, the people on the panel or the editorial board, they look at the work. Fellow scholars, they look at the work and determine whether this is a solid piece of research. Of course, let's not assume that this is neutral. I'm never saying anything is neutral, but the more checks and balances you have, the better. So you have peer-reviewed journals. So peer-reviewed journals is not about prestige, the way the other day Matiangi was making it sound that, oh, if you're in a peer-reviewed journal, your points go up. No, peer-reviewed journal is about academics keeping tabs and putting checks and balances on in terms of knowledge. Conferences, academic conferences are another place where we 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 establish checks and balances, because academics have to present their papers and then be subjected to questions, and that makes the work more rigorous. And then that is within the academy. Outside the academy, you have the media, and that's why I've been saying the media should encourage more debate instead of one-sided interviews. And then you can also have the wider public, just ordinary people. And for me, I would say that members of KOT have really helped me in refining my knowledge, because the questions they ask me, even sometimes the insults, they make me go back and say, okay, that's something I had not heard about, or maybe I need to refine what I think. So we need that public engagement for us to have knowledge that is beneficial to society. It can't be a straight from Dr. Wandia to State House. It doesn't work like that. So once the knowledge has been subjected to debate, then that is now what informs policy. And that's why we have media, that's why we have schools, and that's why we have politicians. Politicians are the ones who are supposed to gauge from what the debates are saying that they are hearing among the people. They are supposed to gauge and represent those views when now policy is being made in parliament. So all that pipeline from peer review, conferences, public debate, interviews, that is what is being skipped when we are asking for research to inform public policy. And there's a danger in advocating for this, because if you don't go through the peer review of fellow academics and the public before you do policy, what you will have is no longer a democracy where Mora can have a say in the policy that affects her. Instead, you have what you call either a technocracy, where it is the technicians who are making decisions, or an epistocracy, where it is only educated experts who are informing policy. And that is dangerous, because policy affects all of us. Everybody will have to deal with the effects of policy. It's not just the people in government and the people who do research for that policy. So, in a nutshell, I'm saying that knowledge cannot be divorced from people. To do research, you have to assume the humanity of everybody, the humanity of the people you are studying, and the humanity of the people who are doing the study. Because to assume that researchers are God who should not be questioned according to other principles that everybody else is questioned by is setting up a society for autocracy. So knowledge must involve people. It must name the people, name who is being studied and who is doing the study, and it must include them. And it must always be done that way, because if we don't do that, it has repercussions for society. And the point of schooling, for those of you who come to school, the point of schooling is to teach you how to ask those questions about who is writing this research, under what conditions, and what does that research imply for all of us, for society, if it was to be implemented as policy. So that is what education is about, to help you name those things. So knowledge must involve people, including you who I am talking to. And that is why I keep saying as I end, stories, stories, stories. Your knowledge matters. The stories that you tell about your life, about the things that you see, about the stories that you hear, that is knowledge, and that knowledge matters. So don't feel that just because you don't have the right language, the right degree, that you are not in the right house, don't feel that that knowledge is not important. It's very important because all knowledge informs society. And so tell your stories.